Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ALBA-IBRO Webinar, Indigenous Voices in Neuroscience, Transforming Research Practice. Before I introduce ALBA Network and IBRO, let me introduce myself. My name is Jacques Ip, an assistant professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm a member of the ALBA Global Diversity and Webinars Working Group. I'm also a member of the IBRO Early Career Committee. The ALBA Network was created to promote equity and diversity in brain sciences. The goals of ALBA are to recognize implicit biases and discriminations and to provide better visibility and professional development opportunities to scientists from underrepresented groups in brain research. The network has more than 2,000 members from 91 countries and keeps on growing every day. If you'd like to get involved or simply support us, you can become an ALBA member. It's free. We thank our founding partners, FANS, IBRO, SFN, and all the organizations that collaborate with the network to make all of our activities possible. In order to carry out its mission, ALBA organized a series of activities. I would like to mention a few today. We highlight diverse scientist profiles for a series of interviews and awards, mentoring sessions, and networking events. A pillar of ALBA's actions is the ALBA Declaration. It is a resource of concrete, positive, evidence-based actions that individuals and organizations at any level can take to promote equity and inclusivity. So I invite you to read and sign it. The webinar organized today is part of a series tackling global diversity with the support of IBRO. The series is designed to shed light on challenges faced by underrepresented neuroscientists regionally, placing them within a global context and exploring potential solutions. You can watch previous webinars of this series and many others on the ALBA YouTube channel. The International Brain Research Organization, or IBRO, is the global organization of neuroscience societies that aims to promote and support neuroscience around the world. IBRO aims to do so by providing support for training, education, research outreach, and engagement activities, as well as the publication of 2 journals, Neuroscience and IBRO Neuroscience Reports. Proceeds from IBRO's journals support more than 90% of IBRO's initiatives. So publishing in IBRO journals contributes to all IBRO's initiatives. If you want to learn more about the opportunities, check out the IBRO website, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter, IBRO Highlights. Next, I want to briefly introduce Natives in Neuro. It is a growing international community of indigenous neuroscientists in academia and beyond. The aim is to increase the representation and visibility of indigenous neuroscientists by fostering a supportive network that empowers members through mentorship, collaboration, and professional development opportunities. They aim to enhance diversity and inclusion within field by celebrating and supporting indigenous perspectives and contribution in sciences. To learn more about this organization and how to get involved, you can connect them on X, subscribe to the mailing list, and attend one of their upcoming events. So Natives in Neuro will be hosting a social at SFN next month, where neuroscientists of all backgrounds will be invited to network with members of the community. On November 12th, the NINDS will be hosting an open stage webinar featuring the Natives in Neuro Executive Board members. You can learn about their career trajectories and ways to get involved with the group. Natives in Neuro is a relatively new organization, so please help us spread the word so we can continue to grow this supportive community of indigenous neuroscientists. So now I will pass the stage to the chair today, Dr. Melissa Peru. So, Dr. Melissa Peru, please.
Hi, everyone. So this webinar is also occurring in partnership with the International Brain Initiative, which is under the trusted leadership of Dr. Judy Illes from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and Dr. Tony Hannon from the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in Australia. And the vision of the International Brain Institute is to catalyze and advance neuroscience through international collaboration and knowledge sharing, uniting diverse ambitions, and disseminating discoveries for the benefit of humanity. Now, to achieve these goals, there are several working groups, including the data standards and sharing, neuroethics, emotional brain, brain mapping, and training and education. And as well, most recently, members of the cross-cultural working group gathered at the Brochet Foundation in Switzerland to discuss Indigenous perceptions in mind and brain. And during this webinar, several of these topics will be addressed. Now, again, I do encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A window, as we really want to facilitate engagement when we get to that portion of the webinar. So today we will be discussing the experiences of Indigenous neuroscientists, and the purpose of this webinar is to shed light on some of the systemic challenges faced by Indigenous researchers in neuroscience, and those challenges that come with integrating Indigenous knowledge and ways of doing into mainstream neuroscience. I am very happy to chair this panel today. As mentioned, my name is Melissa Perro. I am a citizen of the Métis Nation here in Canada and an associate professor at the University of Guelph. And I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our panelists, Olivia Machabane from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, Louise Parr-Brownlee from the University of Otago, Ministry of Business, Science and Innovation in New Zealand, and Rudy Taylor-Bragg from Monash University in Australia. So big welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. So I want to begin with a very important but general question for each of you, and that is, what does Indigenous mean to you? And would you use this to define yourself or use a different terminology? And why don't we start with Rudy?
Thanks. Thanks for having me here. And, before I say anything, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from my home country, my Willumbik, on Marni Bunurong country, down here in the Mornington Peninsula on, about 60 kilometers south of Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge that this country was never ceded, and that if it weren't for the strength of my Luwik, my elders, my ancestors, both past and present, then I wouldn't be speaking to you now at 11 o'clock at night. I'd also like to acknowledge all you mob as well. I really look up to you guys. And obviously, after getting to know Mel and Olivia, I'm proud to see myself as a colleague of yours. This kind of term, though, Indigenous, it's interesting because when there is a kind of ostensible recognition of its place within the broader tenets of the world, but realistically, I'm only defined as an Indigenous person through a colonial lens. I cannot be an Indigenous person unless there is a colonial presence that is defining me as an Indigenous person, because I am a Yawandjeri Bunurong man. That is my identity as much as someone from England can say they're English, or someone from Russia can say they're Russian. So within that, because of the disparity between, I guess the cognitive dissonance between how we view the world and how we understand maps and projections of country, it's a weird kind of discourse and dichotomy in viewing identity, and it's something that every black fella down here has to wrestle with.
Thank you, Rudy. Olivia?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm delighted to be here with everybody. I am Olivia Machubane, as said, and I'm joining from South Africa in Cape Town, and I'm currently based at Stellenbosch University, which in itself is an institution within South Africa which has a history that relates to some of the concepts that we'll be discussing today, which has a colonial history and is working to address and redress some of the historical practices that have undergone and how it's impacted people in South Africa, across the continent. And yeah, so I am currently I'm from the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, which is known as a region where the Amaxhosa people are largely originating from within the country. And that is the cultural group in which I come from. So I think of myself very much from a cultural ethnic group, and that's how I would identify myself as Umxhosa. But there's a long history of indigenous people within the African continent, and the Amaxhosa people were one of the first groups to interact with the San and the Khoi people, who many might have read about through history and within the scholarship, who were the original inhabitants of the Southern African region. So that is sort of the lens in which I come from, and I'm very delighted and look forward to getting into more depth with colleagues in this panel. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you, Olivia. And Louise?
Tēnā rā tātou he mihine nui tēnei kia koutou. So good morning, everyone. It's a very early morning here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So my whakapapa, my genealogy means I am Māori. And like Ree said, we didn't cede sovereignty to a colonial power, that we did sign a treaty, or many Indigenous tribes did sign a treaty, but we did not cede power. And so the word Indigenous is definitely coming from a colonial view. So for me, what it actually means to be Māori is you just have whakapapa, and you identify, and you want to identify, and you are proud about that. And coming with that means that there are ways of thinking and doing and believing that are inherent in how you conduct yourself and go through your world. And for me, that's very much about supporting the people around me and uplifting them, working collectively together. And reciprocity is so important, and that is comes to the fore when you're talking about research context a lot as well. So pleasure to be here, really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. So being from the Métis Nation here in North America, Indigenous is a common word that we would use to describe the major Indigenous peoples of Canada, which would be First Nations, Métis, as well as Inuit. So I think it's really important to note that while Indigenous is commonly used in for some Indigenous peoples, it's not necessarily the proper terminology that's used globally. So just something to think on. Now, before I move on to some additional questions, I want to give everyone, or the panelists, the opportunity to basically introduce themselves and give a little bit of background before we get into some of these questions. So Rudy, did you want to go ahead?
So my name's Rudy Louis Taylor Bragg. I'm a Yalnjarri Bunurong man, living down here, as I said, in southern part of Victoria. I am a PhD student in psych. I guess if I'm being totally candid and honest, my interest and application within the neurospace is exceedingly limited, and has only really been, I guess, recent, probably because of you. but it's one that I've found welcoming solely because of you and Judy and Olivia and, you know, our little working group. Outside of that, it has been, it seems like an alien force. It's not exactly congruent with, I guess, Indigenous worldviews, and you know, I'm sure we'll get into it later on, but yeah, I'm very much a kind of outsider in this space in a lot of senses, but yeah, I've been studying now for about 11 years in tertiary institutions, and I'm fortunate and proud and have the extreme privilege of being a father of a little 1-year-old boy. And yeah, I mean, it's a funny little kind of crossroads I find myself at, but building and building, you know, it's wonderful being a part of those little things where we can kind of connect and you know, stand on the platform that we're fortunate to have inherited.
That's great, Rudy. Thank you. Olivia, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I will expand on what I've shared previously. So, as I mentioned, I am Umxhosa. I'm from a small village called Enele in the Eastern Cape province, which I mentioned. And I am currently a neuroethics researcher at Stellenbosch University. I have navigated all three institutions, higher education institutions in the Western Cape province where my parents came to find employment, better employment opportunities, and where I've also then grown up. In the Western Cape province, you know, there's been a lot of experiences that I've had that aren't always aligned to the way in which my cultural heritage, my cultural background, for like the belief systems that we have, and the traditions that we follow. So those are some of the things that I navigate, having been in predominantly white institutions for a large part of my training. And then also being able to compare with other institutions where I've had collaborations or I've spent some time studying across the country. So my background is in psychology, and then I moved to bioethics, and now I'm currently in neuroethics, which essentially looks at the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscientific technologies that we work with in this context. So I've also been very privileged to be a part of the cross-cultural working group, and I've learned a lot from members of the group. Thank you for all that you've shared, Melissa and Rudy and Judy, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more from Louise on this particular webinar as well. And yeah, I think that's sort of my add-on to my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Louise, did you want to introduce yourself?
Kia ora koutou. So ko tanui me te aroa na waka ko ngā te mene poto te iwi ko Louise Parbrani toku ingoa. So I'm Louise. I come from the Indigenous lands through the middle of the North Island of New Zealand. As a neuroscientist, I am a biomedical scientist, so I work in animal models around Parkinson's disease. It is a context in which being Indigenous is, throughout most of my career, has been very difficult to weave and live in both sets of shoes that I have, but it's a journey that throughout my career has been cemented. I work at the University of Otago. I have been faculty there for the last almost 15 years. And I have seen the context in which I get to work change a lot. New Zealand has been increasing the requirement for all researchers to reduce inequities and have impact in our research. And that has brought both challenges and opportunities as a researcher, an Indigenous researcher in the space as well. One of the things that I do, and for the last about 6 years, I have had senior leadership positions within the within the research context in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I've previously been the director of Ageing World National Science Challenge, and that meant that we had a small funding agency that we in the ageing space, and we allocated half of our funding in our last 5 years to Indigenous research. So it was a space that was completely different to anything else that I'd ever worked in. And currently I am seconded half-time from the university to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. This is the ministry that funds all the research sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I was brought into that sector, into this role in part because they knew they needed someone Māori who was a science advisor in the ministry to really make those changes. So again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the kōrero.
Thank you, Louise. So like you, I am also a translational neuroscientist, and over the years, I've had a very difficult time integrating Indigenous worldviews into my work, just because it's such a reductionist form of research. But I think in the past couple of years, I've really been able to start incorporating more holistic views, Indigenous views into what I do. And when I'm not doing that, I am doing some neuroethics work, again, with Rudy and Olivia in the cross-cultural working group, and under the great leadership of Judy Illis. So my program is kind of completely divided into two separate things, but we will hopefully be getting some information on how we can better integrate Indigenous knowledge into traditional Western or Eurocentric research as we move on through this webinar. So Rudy, to date, there are around 220 Aboriginal psychologists in Australia, but none of them are neuroscientists. So what are the barriers to increasing Indigenous representation in this field?
Well, we have one neurologist, and she graduated, I think, last year. So in terms of neuroscientists, as in, you know, people who research this space, yeah, there's no one that identifies in that role, nor any psychologists that identify as focusing on neuro. So there's multiple reasons as to why, you know, kind of hypothesize why there might be barriers to access in this space. And you know, when we were in at Brochet, and you know, it was one of the things that I presented on was to our little group was the challenges that are kind of fraught in this space, and so much of it, I do believe, you know, relies on I guess that kind of, you know, differences in worldview. But I mean, I have one of my colleagues is just graduated from honors and is doing a clinical PhD, which includes, you know, it's basically a combined master's and PhD program at Monash. And you want to talk about the barriers which exist for Indigenous people. If the treatment that she has had from her neuro professor has been nothing short of disgusting. There is a permeating patriarchal, archaic, exclusionary, and demeaning attitude that exists in this space. And I've spoken to you guys about it, and spoken to our collective experiences in that space, some of us with far more to say on the matter than others. But, you know, for this young girl to step into this space, she's originally from Darwin and moved all the way from, you know, what is ostensibly a small town, even though it's a capital of a state, to big city in Melbourne. and is living away from family. She's completely self-sufficient in her academic career. She has faced that, this constant kind of assumption from people in the neuro department that they know better, and that anything that they do for her is doing her a favor to inform her as to how wrong she is. They disagree with her, and they don't consider her thoughts because she's not a neuro expert, and completely ignore any lived experience that she brings into the situation. And even though that she is now, qualified for this space to study in clinical psych, she gets spoken to as if she has no knowledge or understanding of anything to do with the brain. There's a complete ignorance of culture that permeates through the department when discussing anything to do with neuropsych, and it has led to a really culturally unsafe space for her. And now she will do anything to avoid neuropsychs. Even she said she was on a dating app, and she said if anyone comes up that is has anything to do with neuro, she swipes left on them, because she's just completely burned and finds them repugnant to deal with. Is this the representation that we want to have? Obviously not. Like, we want to be an inclusive scenario, otherwise we wouldn't be here having this webinar. We want to have an inclusive, supportive, celebratory industry that invites broader perspectives to enrich the research that we have. And if this is what the status quo is of the higher ups in this particular place are treating our young researchers to stonewall them from even wanting to progress in their career. When she is spending her nights crying herself to sleep because of how she's been treated and invalidated, and been told to go and do all these neurological testing on how they make assumptions. I've seen her walk into a room and out of a room, and she has been diagnosed on observation alone by this particular person, and based on just how he's observed her in a performance on a exam. And like this kind of idea that this patriarchy, and it's how it's defining this industry. We've seen it historically across all spectrums of academia and tertiary education, and slowly but surely the gates have opened up for broader backgrounds to take influence in their spaces. But we need to nurture young people, and we need to protect them, and we need to make sure that they're safe and secure. And if this is what is happening, and the fact is that I've seen it happen, the invalidation of cultural backgrounds, the invalidation of someone's, just because they're young or because they're a woman or because whatever. Like, I've seen this happen across continents, across hemispheres. So I want to talk about the barriers that that are present with getting more Indigenous people into neuro, but we can't even get that if we can't establish a base level of respect in the industry. So I don't want to seem like it's all doom and gloom, but it's just, how do we get more Indigenous people in? Well, I mean, where's the motivation for me to want to step into it if, again, all that I'm experiencing vicariously through people I care about is negative? These are the things we need to address. These are the things we need to prioritize, and we really need to listen to our young people who are going to be the next custodians of this knowledge and actually do something with the research that we're doing.
So thank you for that heartfelt and thoughtful response, Rudy. I think, it needs to be emphasized that you're not just speaking about the lack of integration of Indigenous knowledge into the work, but also fundamentally how Indigenous people are treated in the industry. And I have also, I think, pretty much every Indigenous person has experienced this type of aggressiveness during at some point of their training or career. And I also think the lack of senior Indigenous people in neuroscience makes it much more difficult for the next generation to find safe spaces where they can be accepted for who they are and what they bring to the table is valued instead of completely disregarded.
The numbers speak for themselves. We have 220 psychologists and not one neuro researcher.
Right.
When we need to ask why, it's because of the things like this, the base levels of respect that are not being adhered to.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say it to make anyone feel bad. It should be said. I'm not trying to like kicking anyone at the moon. It's just about, calling out things if you see something, or, making sure that, hey, you're supporting people. If someone comes to you and says, oh, this or that happened, go and do something about it. These are the people that we need to nurture. As I said, like, what is the point in doing anything that you're doing if you are involved in any kind of research if it is not going to go anywhere? You're just going to put your name in a book and that's it. You just get seconded to the time. You are doing this research to better community, to better health around the world. If you're not doing it, then your motivation is incongruent with the whole point of science in the first place. You need to be focused on the fact that what you are doing now is sowing the seeds for the next generation to put into practice.
Powerful, and hard truths are sometimes needed, and people just have to kind of accept their role in making change. So, Olivia, do you have any role models who you would consider Indigenous or who apply Indigenous methodologies in their research? And how did you go about identifying them?
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for the question. So I would say that it's been a real challenge for me to identify role models in neuroscience specifically who integrate or apply Indigenous methods into the scientific work that they do and just the way in which they live their lives in general. As mentioned, based in the institutions that I've been in, although I have found some senior colleagues who've been extremely supportive and have been curious and open to understanding different ways of knowledge, different ways of knowing and doing, thinking about them from an Indigenous lens, but it's been really difficult to find role models. So a lot of what I've identified has originally been through the literature, through colleagues who've been on, and more senior scholars who've been in other parts of the continent. But one colleague that I will actually highlight, whose work really inspires me and who also focuses her research from the context in which I am from, which is the Eastern Cape province, where it's about more than 97% of the province are amaXhosa speakers, and from the amaXhosa cultural group, where she's done some work looking at Indigenous knowledge in the education system and exploring how the possibilities for health and well-being in the Xhosa South African people, how that links to health and wellness, and the way in which they promote health and wellness considering their Indigenous ways of life. So name is Professor Nikitseng Ned, who's based here at Stellenbosch University. And her work, although it's focused in disability studies, she has done work in the context of mental health as well, and looking at how people, Amambovane people, focus their way of being into how they pursue health and wellness, particularly in the disability context. So one of the things that I think is really, really important is to identify and have these kinds of discussions with Indigenous scholars, to highlight, to spotlight, to share the work that we do. Because I feel like a lot of it, a lot of the work that Indigenous scholars do, and people who are actively trying to create knowledge in this way, because I feel like a lot of it is quite sort of marginalized and not taken as real science, and that's something you do, what are the chances that you're going to get funding to do that kind of work? That's the kind of impressions that I get. And also just kind of, being thought of as not doing real science if you're thinking about the methodologies and the practices and how to ensure that they are in alignment with people who follow an Indigenous way of life. So I think that's something that I've struggled with. And even looking to other contexts, looking to other continents, looking to other scholars from regions like New Zealand and Australia, who have really spent a lot more time, and Canada is sort of grappling and unpacking some of these concepts, even though there are a lot of scholars that I may not know of that I'm still learning about on the African continent. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in making sure that we have role models for the next generation of scientists in this area.
So I think you and Rudy have really made clear some of the substantial challenges that Indigenous people, whether they're already established or they're still young and in their training, are trying to overcome in this neuroscience space. And I think this leads really well into my question for you, Louise, which is what structures and processes therefore need to be in place for Indigenous researchers and the communities they serve in order to flourish in neuroscience?
So thank you for that. Yes, I agree. It is a nice follow-up question. So acknowledging that the comments that Olivia and Rudy have made, that I agree with that. There is definitely a power dynamic, and it's very difficult to operate in the spaces. Often our views are silenced, and the ways that we work are not. It's very difficult to bring them into the space so that we can actually flourish. For us, we are often working collectively. Our focus is about the outcomes for the community, and we want to uplift and empower the community to find the solutions that they have for the questions and for the directions that they want to move in. And so that does mean that we operate in a very, very different way. We're not interested in we have to publish, and we do that well, but we're not so interested in publications and impact factors, and grants are a necessary process in order so that we can do the work. But to actually move forward and actually change the system, from what I've seen where I've seen it work very well, in order to make significant change, the first thing that needs to happen is that Indigenous people need to be in decision-making roles, and that means governance and leadership. You need that in order to actually change the structures that are there, because the points of view need to be in every single conversation, and it changes who's appointed and the values in which an organisation works within. It also starts to dismantle the power dynamics, so that the non-Indigenous people need to release a lot of the power, and it does mean that Indigenous peoples come in and start to pick up and start to change the system. Equity becomes very much a focus of the way the group will operate. And that comes down to things like, if you're going to have equitable outcomes, the first thing you have to do is fund it appropriately. So maybe half of that funding should be going to the work for and focused on the Indigenous group. The way when we are working, we are often having to address historic injustices, and so it means that we're having to really disrupt the system, and I have seen that this is possible. So within Aotearoa New Zealand, the National Science Challenges, there were Indigenous leaders that were brought into every single challenge to change the space, and what that did, a flow-on effect that had within the ministry that funds the science system, is that they then recognised how much it made a difference to the research that was being funded, what was rewarded and valued, and they started requiring other types of research funding to actually address inequities and address bring Māori researchers into their teams. So it can completely change the way that the science sector actually worked. And it feels really different. It feels different for us. I mean, for me, going in and being able to be who I am unapologetically was revolutionary. But it also felt really different for non-Indigenous researchers. They came into the space, and when the relationships that you have with people are at the fore, they recognised how different that felt. And it was uplifting for them, as well as for the Indigenous researchers, and as well as the communities that we served. So people came on board, but they had to release that power, and they had to step back and recognise that they were going to have to do things differently in order for that to happen. Kia ora.
Thanks, Louise. So yeah, it's not an easy process for non-Indigenous people to be able to step back. And I think that also leads well into my next question, which is a general question for all of you. So any of you can answer. And for that, I want to talk a little bit about connections. So Indigenous peoples are very, very diverse across the globe, and that's really, really important to keep in mind and remember. But connections and making connections seems to be a commonality across Indigenous peoples. And holistic or holism are often words that are used, but these concepts I find are not widely valued by neuroscientists. And in fact, I sometimes think people are actually scared of the word holistic or holism if they, think it's not real or not valid. So why do you think holism should be incorporated into neuroscience? And how could we further define or defend a holistic approach in medical or neuroscience research? Anyone can jump in to answer that.
Just pick someone.
Oh, pick someone? Okay, Rudy, go ahead.
Man, the older I get, the less sense a reductionist approach makes to me. And it's a serious problem when it comes to like I honestly view the entire field of neuro research as it's in its complete infancy. It's so heavily reliant on instruments and data, and that has given this complete false sense of confidence in in the ability to ascertain the beginning, middle, and end of the story of a brain and what it represents. And there's that kind of adage, we know more about the universe than we do our own brains, right? And in that similar sense, it's obviously elucidating this idea that we know bugger all about what goes on behind, between our two ears. And while we can measure so much and, we're constantly evolving in these spaces, and we've got all these amazing technologies that we can rely on, the moment that we try to narrow it down in any kind of field, the more convoluted the answers become. Okay, I've got a bad elbow from playing tennis, so I put a wrap on it, and then all of a sudden it overcompensates with a bunch of different muscles, and all my shots go wild. And it's like a similar view with, I guess reductionist versus holistic. It's like the kind of the podiatrist observation. It's like people watch this person limping down the street, and a chiropractor goes, "Oh, I know what's wrong with them. They've got a bad back," And a physio watches them, and they go, "Oh, I know what's wrong with them. They've got a bad shoulder. It's that's causing them to crank up." And then the podiatrist goes, "Oh, I know what's wrong with them. They've got a problem with their foot." And it's like, of course, they're all right. Anyone that lives with chronic pain knows that it's all interrelated, and what makes sense here? A holistic view to go, well, we correct this problem with the feet, and all of a sudden it's going to start alleviating problems in the back and the shoulder as the things go up, because it's going to help them walk better. Like, it's not. It does. What are we doing? We're treating the symptoms or the causes. And we get so caught up in working out what's wrong with people that we've got this kind of reductionist, reactive approach, and that is the crucial thing that is wrong with Indigenous health. Look at a dialysis center. I use this analogy a lot, but it makes sense. A dialysis center is reliant on people coming in and out that door twice a week, 9 to 5. And the moment that there is a cure for diabetes, those doors close. So what incentive does that business under this capitalist structure have to ever find a cure for diabetes? Zero. Absolute nothing. Their incentive is to keep their door open and invent new ways to do dialysis in a quicker amount of time so they can get more people in the door. There is not a single part of this entire process in terms of healthcare that is caring for people. It is caring for pockets. And the moment that we start to identify that we need to create foundational shifts in terms of holistic, strengths-based approaches, which is not exactly congruent with a lot of neuro research. Neuro research is trying to identify what goes wrong more often than really understanding how things work. And at least in my observation, and it's at what point do we want to start making generational changes for the better of humanity?
Rudy, you mentioned strength-based approaches, and that is really important, and I think has a lot of relevance to my next question, which is about stereotypes. So historically, there have been many negative stereotypes. Good examples of this are stereotypes surrounding substance use or mental health issues in Indigenous communities. So how can we shift the dynamic away from these types of deficit-based research approaches or deficit-based thoughts to more of strength-based approaches, which not only recognizes colonizers' own responsibility to the situations that Indigenous peoples that they're in, but also recognizes positive ways which we can do our work and change the dynamic, so we can recognize that the strengths within these communities and the resilience to institute change. So, Louise, did you want to address on how we can fight these stereotypes?
Yes, I do, but I do want to pick up on the previous point as well, just a little bit.
Sure.
So when I think about holism, I take another step back and actually start thinking about the environment that we work in, because we cannot flourish unless our environment is good, and we've got environmental challenges. And for the Pacific peoples, the fact that we've got climate change, and many of them, their atolls, their islands are going to be significantly reduced in size or may disappear altogether, is going to be a huge problem. No one is a condition, and yet neuroscience and the medical system actually focuses on conditions. We think holistically about how the brain works, and one of the classic examples of thinking holistically is that we don't just think at a cell level. So Rudy was talking about this. We think about the whole brain, we think about the whole body, and that becomes incredibly important when you think about things like dementia, which in a Western framework has these negative connotations. People need a lot of care and support. But in an Indigenous space, it often means that, or one interpretation that is often applied, is that people are going to a much more spiritual space. And that it can be viewed positively. So we can have quite a different perspective. And I always think how fascinating and reductionist it is that you can have conditions of the brain that some of them are treated by neurologists and some of them are treated by psychiatrists. It's still the brain, it's still the same networks, and it's the whole of body approach is so incredibly important. To get to the negative stereotypes, I'm going to use one statistic. And it actually comes from the Dunedin study, which is a longitudinal study that has been going for over 52 years. The number of Indigenous peoples in there is a group, but it is not a significant proportion. But for mental health and the stereotypes alongside these, and particularly when people start to apply that in negative ways to Indigenous peoples, the Dunedin study has shown that in the first 50 years of life, 86% of people have had a mental health disorder. And so having a mental health disorder is actually the normal. And so we need to start reframing this. This is not an Indigenous issue. It is a whole of society issue. And that when people start applying it specifically to Indigenous peoples, that is a bias and stereotype that they are applying. It needs to be called out.
Even the terminology about it, man, even like you look at how can you not be holistic when you look at a central nervous system splayed out? Like look at it, it connects everything. And then and the language about this deficit-based language is damaging. If I'm walking down the street and the train goes past and I see someone get hit by a train, bang, splat, disappeared. I watch this and just say, I start getting nightmares about it, reliving it. You go to a psychologist and they say, okay, you got post-traumatic stress disorder. If I walk down the street, the same thing happens, but the person's watch flies off. It hits me in the head. That's an injury. What is the difference? Because the disorder puts the onus on the victim. There's a disorder says there's something wrong with you. The injury, oh, well, this is an unfortunate accident. That can happen. You walk, you roll your ankle, it's an injury. The language about this is so problematic. And we're talking about destigmatizing. I mean, these are the things that we need to take before we can even visit these ideas of colonization, how history and society and these things impact people. How can we even visit that space if it's already such an unsafe space to be in the first place when we're looking at it like the term, even the sheer terminology, and what are we up to, the DSM-5 now? Like it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving to be more inclusive and less derogatory in the people that it's persecuting. But like you look at the foundation in the difference just in that simple thing, a difference in the terminology between post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress injury. because you have been injured, because you have seen this horrible thing happen, and you deserve empathy and care and validation in that experience.
I'd like to actually add on to what Rudy has just shared and just tie on the 2 points that have just been discussed around holism and language. And one of the key things, again, I'll just emphasize what Melissa also mentioned earlier on. I'm speaking from a South African perspective. I'm speaking from, thinking about my own cultural ethnic group background. And although there is no one monologue of Africans and an African perspective or worldview, but there is recognition and there's a lot of scholarship from philosophers across the continent who have identified that when it comes to brain and mental health conditions, many African cultures tend to look at the whole sort of the whole of the issue. It's not just about the person who's experiencing those particular symptoms, but rather they try to understand, like in my culture, what could this be signifying? What message could this be bringing? What is it within the family lineage that might need healing? What is it within the community? What is it within the society? And so, although they may be, visiting a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that's really just to deal with the symptoms, but really there's a broader, more larger healing that is recognized and needs to occur. And there's some form of imbalance within that particular individual or family structure. And so, I think thinking about language as well, which I've found in the work that I do, working with people, across people with psychosis, is being very careful around language. How do they understand their condition? What is the word that they use? Instead of coming with these terminologies which may actually perpetuate stigma and actually may not align with the way in which that particular cultural group or that particular community understands health, mental health, and well-being. And so I think, the concept and spirituality that Louise brought in is something that's very important when it comes to the holism. And I think there's a lot of strengths that those kinds of Indigenous ways of healing and thinking about health and well-being can actually infer to the way in which we deal with brain, mental health, and neurological conditions. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Thank you, Olivia. So I think we'll have one more question and then we'll move to the Q&A so we can answer some of the audience's questions. So there has been a lot more awareness, especially in the last few years, regarding using a dual perspective in research. So combining Indigenous and Western Eurocentric types of approaches and ways of doing in research. So in Canada, this concept actually has a name. It's called two-eyed seeing. And I was wondering if any of you could elaborate more on what this actually means, utilizing this dual perspective, either through a neuroscience research lens or clinical care. Anybody?
I know what you guys think, so I want to hear what Louise has, because we've just been writing a big paper about this. So,
okay. So a dual perspective. So having worldviews that are both, or maybe it's having training that is predominant, aspects of your training that are predominantly European, Western based, and then having a cultural worldview that you've grown up with that is Indigenous. Often those two views do not meet in some specialties. So for me, I am a biomedical researcher, so they have not met very well traditionally. The way that I think about this is when I'm doing research, and particularly when it's research aligned with communities and questions and statements that I've heard communities say, I view that I want to use the the knowledge system and the methods that are going to best answer those questions. So often I want to use a mixture of both of them. I don't necessarily want to join them per se. I'm using one or the other at any particular time, but I want to use the strengths that each of them can bring so that I get the best outcomes for the community. So I will describe that as working at the interface between two systems and understanding when it's good or better to use one versus the other. Yeah, that's how I view it.
Yeah, so that's great. And I 100% agree. So it's not about one being dominant or better than the other. It's understanding when one is going to be used and will take center stage over the other one, and recognizing that neither is dominant, both are equal, and they're integrated in such a way that the end product ends up being better for everybody. So that's what we mean when we talk about these dual perspectives. And I think that if more researchers would be open to these holistic approaches and understanding how and why it's important to look at the big picture, for example, how spirituality might feed into resilience to combating a certain disease or disorder, right? When you think about things like that, not only are you broadening your perspective and coming up with more innovative questions, innovative ideas, you're also doing what's best for your patients if you're a clinical practitioner. So there's so many advantages to being open to more than one way of thinking. And I'm hoping that in the future, more people will embrace this type of idea. Okay, so I think I will ask you one more question and then we will move on to the Q&A. So would any of you be able to share an experience that produced a significant change in a community or a research outcome, and include why that was so important to you? Olivia, do you have any?
I think I'll let the others go first. Thanks.
Rudy, Louise?
I want practical changes for my community, and I want my son to grow up in a better world than the one that I found, that was better than the one that my parents found and that my grandparents found, and the world that we inherited is going to be better and brighter in the future each and every day, let alone beyond our lifetime. And this kind of Indigenous conceptualization of dreaming, where we have one foot in the future and one foot in the past, you know, showing our connections and our care for the future, for Yiramboy tomorrow, but also remaining present. This misconstrued kind of segregation of times as opposed to a broader view that encapsulates all of them. Practical solutions are often sensible ones. And when we talk about things that I've seen in my lifetime, we have a program here called The Torch. So there's a couple of paintings in this room done by people who go through the Torch program. That snake up there is one of them. They go out into the prisons. And I come from 2 generations of incarcerated Indigenous people. And, you know, growing up in that kind of environment or around people who are in those environments is something that I'm familiar with. And it's something that I really, really care about as well. And, you know, Aboriginal people in Australia are the most incarcerated people per capita in the world. And that sucks. I mean, you know, I could pull stats constantly about how miserable, you know, I'm 33 and I'm halfway through my life, statistically speaking. When I talk about tangible things that we can do, practical solutions, the torch goes into prisons and they teach people how to paint. So what is that? That is gainful employment, because art doesn't care about the mistakes you've made in the past. If anything, it adds clout. And it's cultural engagement. And I've met people through that program who have said, I had to go to prison to learn my own cultural dance. I had to go to prison to learn my language. I had to go to prison to learn where I'm from, where my people are from. That shouldn't be the place that we have to be in for people to have the ability to engage, but it's the reality. And it's such a simple thing. And I often think what my life would be like if my grandfather had that opportunity when he was locked up. The difference is that he didn't, and he lived his entire life in shame, and he had to lie about who he was and make excuses for the way that he looked. Little things like that, they matter, and we can make and facilitate positive changes and see changes in our lifetime. The torch is young. It's less than 10 years. I think it's about 10 years old, less than 15 years old. And they have the highest recidivism rates out of any external program in the country. So the change in the precipice 4 is available. It is tangible. It is realistic. It's about making positive steps and wanting to in the first place. And there's a lot of people who are incentivized to keep the status quo. Those people who are gripping power weakly and unjustly, there's a reason why they want things to stay they are, because they're comfy. And we need to demand more and better of ourselves and our colleagues, because the next generation deserve it. Simple as that. What is the point in anything that we do in our lives if it is not for a brighter tomorrow? You're muted. No.
I am. I'm always that person. Thank you, Rudy. Louise, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was trying to decide between some experience I've had with funding and how that uplifts the communities, so older people in particular, kaumātua. But I think I'm going to share some learnings that I've had around the inequities of something that's relatively not standard, but accepted within the neuroscience field, and that's deep brain stimulation. So deep brain stimulation, Aotearoa, New Zealand, is offered to about 10 people per year. But when you stop and think about the demographic of people with Parkinson's disease tend to be older, over 60 years of age, and that often means that they have complex health needs, often high blood pressure, diabetes and other conditions, multi-morbidities. And as soon as you have multi-morbidities with aging, which is normal, it will mean in New Zealand that it's deep brain stimulation is not going to be offered as a treatment, because they want to make sure that the few people that get offered this treatment actually are going to have this unbelievable outcome. And so that all sounds kind of reasonable. You see an age-related inequity, but it's only when you stop and think about what that means if you're from an Indigenous group, where we have a 7-year shorter lifespan, our health is not as good because of injustices and barriers to care for over a century. And then you stop and think about the fact that probably would never actually get offered deep brain stimulation. And so there's a structural barrier in the system that has been built in. So I started thinking about these things about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was really fortunate to partner up with some other Indigenous women, and we started to have conversations with the community about their experiences. And what came to the fore is how important holistic approaches to well-being are. And that can be things, so looking at the whole person, the whole body, looking at the fact that when we go into a health system, we have certain practices that we want to put in place. So we might want to do karakia or incantations to take our body from a restricted or sacred space into an unrestricted space so that the surgery can actually happen. But actually getting the time, for that person or their family to actually get that time and space is so very, very difficult. But we do need fit for purpose surfaces, and often the changes, some of the changes at least, can be relatively easy to implement. Another realization is that when we talk about biomedical research, people are like, oh, I'm going to find out new information, and that's going to mean that it's possibly a new drug or this amazing new treatment. Well, actually, when you're from an Indigenous population, that does not mean it's going to get to you. There are so many barriers, even something as simple as the latest drug for diabetes. Often people won't be offered that drug for all sorts of biases. And when you're talking about technologies, we don't always want it. And so talking to the community and finding out what they actually want. So I did quite a lot of research around deep brain stimulation, and I've started to have these conversations, and then I stepped back and completely changed my research program, and now I'm looking at dietary factors that you can harness to maybe slow the progression of something like Parkinson's disease. So it can, yeah, these experiences can actually be life-changing.
Thank you. Olivia, I have a question from the audience that I think that you would be really great to answer, because you were speaking of this with respect to some of your own personal experiences finding mentorship. Mm-hmm. So how would a student or a trainee be able to find a supervisor that actually their views align with their values and their community-based missions? So what would your recommendation be for a trainee to be able to find a supervisor like that?
Mm-hmm. I think it depends on, where the student is based. I always think about, it's really important to do research that aligns with your values. Research that will be able to, at the end of the day, impact the communities that you want to impact, and have the outcomes that you would like to see. So first of all, I would do my homework with regards to who are the scientists, if it's neuroscientists or mental health scientists. It really does depend, and I think sometimes we restrict ourselves. We've had a lot of discussion today around some of the limitations within the neuroscience domain, but your supervisor could be from a different discipline, and they could have a shared sense of values, and also, methodologies, and the way in which they do the work that they do, and the way in which they supervise. A student who just graduated with their PhD, a PhD graduate, recently said that their supervisor is great at being human. And I think that that's an amazing thing, to find somebody who's actually great at being human, not just the science. Because at the end of the day, the journey, I think, having undergone PhD training, I think the journey is the most important, and who you are at the end of that journey. And if you're going to be with the most brilliant neuroscientists or scientists, but you have experiences like the ones that Rudy mentioned earlier on, that's going to be a really difficult training experience for you. So I think that that's something really important, to taking time to reaching out to people who you feel might have a connection to the way in which you want to do your work, asking them for a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting if they're in close proximity, and really getting a sense of what are their values and how do they align with yours, I think is something that's really, really important. And I was just going to say that also finding programs that are also aligned with that. And I wanted to share on an example from the African continent, which is called the Human Hereditary and Health in Africa initiative, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust and the NIH, which at the end of the day had research projects in genomics and neuropsychiatric genomics, which is a field that I've worked in quite a lot, which was African-led. So it was led from people from the communities. So what Louise was talking about in terms of what do the people actually want, what kind of science is important that's going to benefit the communities, it was driven from that angle and actually resulted in almost 1,000 PhDs and master's students who graduated from that program. I'm also one of them. So I think when it comes to your previous question also around science that has an impact and in terms of the outcome for the communities, that's one example that stands out for me, and continuously had supervisors who were in a supported, connected community who came together regularly to check in on how are they supporting students, what is the training that is required from students who specifically come from these particular backgrounds with low resources and have certain cultural lenses that they want to bring into the work that they do. So that's a long response to those two areas. Thank you.
So I think that answered another question that we had from the audience regarding how supervisors are able to support Indigenous students, not only in their research, but also in their lives and what their needs are. So thank you for that, Olivia. I want to go full circle and really come back to something that Rudy spoke about at the very beginning, and this was the lack of students in neuroscience. Now, we do see Indigenous trainees go into the medical field, but we don't see a lot of Indigenous trainees going into neuroscience. I know a handful of translational or basic Indigenous neuroscientists who don't directly focus necessarily on community research, but are interested in the mechanisms of disease and things like that. I find that those people are a rarity in the rarity that we already see with Indigenous people in the medical field or medical neurosciences. So how can we shift the dynamic and get more trainees to actually also want to enter neuroscience research as opposed to a medical field?
Man, having people, like, university is a pretty alien environment for mob to kind of step into. I remember in my undergrad, there was one professor that gave an acknowledgement of country before his class, and that was my entire undergrad. And that was first year philosophy. This old fella, he looked like Dumbledore if you shrunk him down to be like 5 foot tall. He was a fantastic professor. And it was the only class I ever got an HD in my undergrad. Outside of that, I never felt like I was particular. I don't want to say I didn't feel welcome, because I feel a sense of entitlement where I live, but safety is another thing, and identity is another thing as well. And having a safe space to express identity is a different thing within an ostensibly alien environment like a university, which, most of us are the first people in our families to go to these places. So when I stepped into Monash and you drive in, and front and center as you're driving in before the car parks is a giant flagpole with the Aboriginal flag in the middle. I felt a sense of safety, that there's a tokenism there, but it's a sense of welcomeness and a sense of, you know, you'll be all right here. So going into that space, I had that as a kind of disposition, and then meeting people who are experienced, you know, academics in the university. The number one thing that helped was having people in my corner who can navigate the systems and the bureaucratic structures of the university. I can stand up for myself, but I'm also just going to bounce if this situation is not going to be appropriate for me to be in, or if I don't feel safe, or I feel like it's a waste of time. I've got better things to do. Realistically, I would not. There is so much in my life that I can be thankful for the really, truly dear people who I work with, who are both, I'm so privileged to have as my supervisors. I've got 3 supervisors in particular, and 2 panel members. And without those 5 people, my life and the trajectory of it would be completely different. So you can make positive changes in people's lives. You can see tangible changes in people's lives. I'm speaking from experience because I spent 4 years being homeless when I was 19 years old. Like, people who come from where I come from, who have gone through the things that I've gone through in my upbringing, do not end up like this, usually. I'm very much an outlier, and I'm thankful and I'm privileged to be in this position. And I would not be here if it wasn't for having those people in my corner that just know how to work the system, that know how to stand up, that know when to pull the trigger. Having those people, and there are people in this thing who are watching this thing, you are that person, and you can be that person for these people. So several of the questions that are in the Q&A right now, this is answering most of your question. How can we get more people into this space? By being that person, being a good ally, being an advocate for introducing people into these spaces, and using your privilege, which we all have. We're in academia, we are privileged people. Like that goes without saying. We are all privileged. It's not a taboo word to be mindful of. We have all worked to achieve a level of privilege, and something to be thankful for, and something to show gratitude for. So coming into this space, now that we're here, we need to help put our hand out and help other people up with us, because they're going to be the ones that take what we do now into the future. They're going to be the shoulders that we always talk about, that we stand on. You know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Be the next giant and help the next person come up on top of yours.
Rudy, I think that was really powerful. And I think that really speaks to what I want to talk about next, and that's allyship. And I think that's a really great way to end the webinar today with this question. And for the audience, for those questions that I could not get to, I apologize. But I would be happy to follow up on any of your questions personally if you want to reach out. So this question really, I think, speaks to many of the people in the audience, and that is the question of allyship. My experience is that people can be afraid. They want to be allies, but they're afraid that they're going to make a mistake. They're afraid that they're not going to do something right, and that we might punish them or something. But punishment really is a colonial way of thinking about things, because Indigenous people, we don't think that way. We're very accepting. As long as you listen and want to learn, we are very, very open to mistakes. It's a part of growth. So I would like each of you to end this webinar in the next 5 minutes on allyship and how can people be good allies. Let's start with you, Louise.
Kia ora. So allies, I think the place to start is don't be afraid to have the conversations with us one-on-one, and don't be afraid. I mean, language is really important, but don't be afraid to have the conversation and know at times you're going to feel awkward and stumble, because when I'm having the conversation with people, I am listening to the language, but I'm listening and looking at so much more. There's an energy that comes when someone is actually working with good intent, and with wanting to really make some changes. So yeah, have the conversations. When we're operating in more, so that's a one-on-one conversation. When we're operating in spaces that are more public, when we're in meetings, when we're with other colleagues, I would say things like advocate for us, but don't take up our space and our time. So if there are things that people are asking about what needs to happen for Māori, for Indigenous peoples, let us have the conversation. Be aware in a dynamic whether it is safe or not for us to be able to speak as well. And if we do say something, come in and support that and add to that conversation from your understanding on why you believe these things are so important. I think the final thing is there will always be colleagues of ours who are not safe and are not allies. And it's really helpful if allies can ask difficult and hard questions of our colleagues. Well, why do they believe that view? Have they considered that that view might be biased? Because it's safer for them to ask those kind of views in spaces than it will be for us.
Thank you. And Olivia, we will end with you in the last 2 minutes. Can you give us your thoughts on how someone can be a good ally?
Yes, thank you so much. I think I've had some incredible allies who have helped me get to where I am today. And I just want to say, when it comes to the topic that we spoke about earlier on, the next generation trainees, please try to be supportive, listen. Sometimes you don't even have to say anything. Be curious, but in a respectful way, and allow them to share as much as they want to share. As Louise said, sometimes there may be uncomfortable conversations that happen, and you may need to come back and reflect on those conversations and why were they uncomfortable and what was it challenging within you and your ways of being and seeing the world. I think let's all be courageous enough to be able to call out injustices that we see. Sometimes that may require calling them out publicly. Sometimes that may require calling them out silently or, offline. But I think taking the time to do that, showing your support, makes a difference. And I'm grateful to everybody who has contributed to my own growth and to those around me, and who continue to step up and step to the table to ensure that we create inclusive spaces and environments for students and colleagues from all backgrounds. So that's where I would end it. Thank you so much, Melissa, and to the colleagues who are panelists on this session and everybody who's listening and sharing in this energy space. Thank you.
And with that, I would really like to thank again the panelists for joining us. It's been a really, hopefully, insightful conversation for the audience that joined us today. I would like to thank the audience for being here, ALBA-IBRO, and of course, the IBI for supporting this work. And I encourage everyone to please take the short survey and let us know what you thought. Thank you again. Bye now.